Hello, welcome to this short video about inflation and modern monetary economics. This video divides into two parts. Firstly, causes of inflation, and then things that get used to control inflation. So the first thing I want to do is a quick recap about what should be the most important aim for the government in respect to the economy. That is, the government's got to balance the money in circulation with the productive capacity. And I should mention at this point that the terms productive capacity and goods and services for sale are interchangeable in this context. The productive capacity produces the goods and services. So we've used two analogies so far. The first is the scales concept, where the amount of dollars is in balance with the amount of goods for sale. If the dollars is too low, it means a dulled economy. If it is too high, there will be inflation. The second is where we had a diagram of the size of some sectors, and then we spent too much money in those sectors, and they stretched the size of the sector outside what is known as the maximum spending footprint, and that causes inflation. We also had a diagram where we had the circulation of goods and money, and we talked about them being in balance. I just want to extend that a little. So I've split the goods and money parts out. The size of the donuts indicate the size of the relative size of the productive capacity and money circulating. When they are the same or very close, the economy is balanced and doing well. When the size of the money versus the productive capacity is unbalanced, where the money one is larger, then inflation will occur. Note that by far the most common inflation causing circumstance is not when too much money is created, but when productive capacity collapses. It is prudent to mention there is another form of inflation that is possible too. Besides money imbalance inflation, there is cost push inflation. This is where an important economic commodity, and the classical one is oil, rises in price, and this ripples through the economy, resulting in rising prices in all things affected by oil costs. Cost push inflation can be managed by all the same inflation controls as for money imbalance. Okay, so we should be pretty comfortable with what causes inflation now. So the question is, why is it such an important thing for modern monetary economics, and how does modern monetary economics propose to manage it? Well, modern monetary economics intends to keep utilisation of economic capacity higher than what is typically done under contemporary mainstream economics. We can see that from some of the diagrams from earlier videos. The maximum spending footprint is quite close to the maximum capacity footprint, and as we know from the utilisation inflation curve, that means we'll be in the much steeper part of the inflation zone on the graph. So in short, modern monetary economics intends to fly a bit closer to the limit than what has been done in the last 20 to 30 years. Therefore, modern monetary economics needs to get prepared to get out of higher than target inflationary areas, should it end up in them. There's broadly two schools of control mechanism for doing this. One is preemptive and the other is reactionary. Some things, like tax, could fall into both categories. It depends on the type of tax it is to determine which group it belongs to. The list of things in the toolbox is thus: regulational controls, tax-based controls, bond sales, careful monitoring of the economy, spending delays, spending reductions, and the implementation of non-inflational spending programs like the job guarantee. I'll talk through a couple of the preemptive or planning controls. The preemptive ones aren't so much about cutting off inflation that's grown above target. They're more about making sure you can still get your objectives met without triggering excessive inflation in the first place. An example of the regulational control could be a ban on new coal power stations. Assuming that investments would have been made to build the stations in the future, then this regulation will suppress that, freeing up resources that would have been used to do it, and therefore having a deflationary effect. The smart government doesn't just leave this open-ended though, it then creates regulation that redeploys the resources. This could be legislation requiring a renewable generation quota. That way all the, for example, steel-making, concrete and labour hours are redirected where it wants it, while still keeping the economy overall at a consistent level. Another preemptive control example, a tax one, would be knowing that you're going to need a lot of steel for future renewables projects. So the government puts a tax on the steel. This provides a deflationary situation for just that product, which the smart government can then use to its advantage, and it purchases this steel for doing its renewables projects. The job guarantee is another simple preemptive one. You set up a system that meets objectives, in this case full employment, while also setting it up to be non-inflational. The careful monitoring of the economy is basic diligence. These days, with the depth and breadth of data collection we have, this would simply be collected and presented to the government in terms of reporting things likely to cause inflation, which mostly boils down to the utilisation of resources in sectors and geographical areas, etc. We can see this with the analysis I did of Australia's economic data from the first two videos, where I presented those 5 graphs on the one page. Remember, when Australia's deficits were running around 3% of GDP, then most things in the economy were pretty stable, That's the sort of thing you could use to give you some feedback with what the spending the government can do. The best reactive method is by doing bond purchase. Without going into detail here, but it will be done in the next video, I'll discuss about bonds, interest rates and mainstream economics. But under modern monetary economics, we can leave interest rates at zero, and then with no requirement to control it, that frees up bonds to be used for another purpose. And the obvious one is for draining money to fight inflation. As and when inflation begins to rise too much, money could be drained from the economy by the sale of bonds. This locks away buying power for various periods of time. If the government felt there was more inflationary threat, it could sell more bonds. If there was less inflationary threat, then it might sell less. Economies are not delicate, despite what the media would have you believe. So it's not like anyone has to freak out that inflation would rocket out of control before we saw it coming. Economies are quite robust and slow moving, so inflation control is comfortably manageable. Also, it's not like we haven't run the economy with a feedback mechanism before. That's the exact mechanism we've attempted to use for the last 40 years. It was simply watch the growth rate, and if it's too low, cut interest rates, and if it's too high, raise them. So in modern monetary economics, it will be if inflation is too high, raise bond sales. If it is too low, cut them, or don't have any, and or spend some more. I call mainstream economics use of interest rates blunt instrument economic management, to contrast against modern monetary economics use of several sharp instruments to control the economy nicely and precisely. Taxes could be made reactionary, however there may be some resistance from both public and business. An example would be having tax rates determined by inflation rates. If inflation was above a target range, taxes, say income and corporate, would have a 2% surcharge on top. If it was below a certain range, it could have a 2% discount. Some people may resist this though, because it makes planning your financial circumstances a bit more difficult, because they will be a bit less certain. Beyond this, there's always spending delays or cancellations. Of course, these should be a last resort, as it amounts to a government not delivering or delaying delivering on what it said it would. So, to summarise, inflation is important to modern monetary economics because it intends to run the economy with a higher level of inflation, and obviously the higher it is run, the more risk there is of an overshoot into troublesome territory. That said, there's actually a wide scope within which to run it, and mainstream economics is currently having problems with inflation being too low. So an increase from the current levels of 2% up to 3.5% is likely to be a major help. Above that, there is still a large realm where inflation can operate and not cause problems. Up to 10% should be possible. So a government that targets 5% is hardly putting the economy in danger. An economy that gets above, say, 10% is not just going to plunge straight into hyperinflation either, where the rate ends up greater than 100% for multiple years. Those sorts of events are normally caused by plunges in productivity first, then massive incorrect management of the economy second. Speaking of inflation problems, they were the cause of why countries went away from the forerunner of modern monetary economics in the 1970s. The next video looks at what went wrong, how we did handle it, how we should have handled it, and how things likely would have turned out if we did manage it better. So thanks for watching and listening, and I'll see you in the next video.